This year I never really made a video about Samhain, about the themes of Samhain and my experience of it this year, and I kind of like to make videos about all the different Sabbats each time they come around, if I have something in particular in mind that I want to talk about around that theme, because even though we see the same themes coming up over and over again, our experiences of them change and the way that we're thinking about those themes definitely change over time. So for me, at least this year, and I think I definitely made another video maybe 2 years ago about Samhain that touched on some kind of similar concepts, but for me the central theme of Samhain is death. And whether we're looking at kind of Samhain or Halloween, All Souls Day, I think all of the different associations that we have with this time of year, they really do kind of boil down to death, and specifically to the spiritualization of death, the way that we as pagans, pantheists, earth-based spiritual practitioners, the way that we spiritualize death, conceptualize death, the way that we cope with death, I suppose, through looking at it through a spiritual lens and through incorporating it into our practice, into our spiritual lives. I've made videos in the past about mortality, and I will link them somewhere for you to find easily, but today I really want to talk more about the way that death intersects with our conceptions of divinity, and specifically around kind of certain gods, and just the kind of mystical experiences that we have in general in this kind of spiritual, alternative spiritual community. So I'm not going to talk in this video about ancestors because I feel like, even though I didn't directly talk about ancestor worship in the videos that I'm thinking about, where I talked about mortality and so on, and how to cope with mortality, or how I cope with mortality as a pantheist, even though I didn't directly talk about ancestors in those videos, I feel like the question of ancestors and ancestor reverence really ties in well with the ways that I talked about coping with your own mortality and the mortality of those around you, by thinking about the ways in which you are linked to other people, the ways in which you leave a legacy behind, whether that's just through your physical body, whether that's through works that you leave behind, whether that's through children, or just your relationships with other people and the lives that you have touched. And I definitely feel like ancestor worship plays a big role in all of that as well. I think that can be a really wonderful way to kind of tap into that sense of continuing a legacy, and not just feeling like this kind of isolated pawn who's having this kind of frighteningly short life a lot of the time is how we experience it. I think thinking about ancestor worship is a wonderful way of tapping into that. But of course, ancestor worship as part of Samhain, as part of Halloween, it definitely is connected to this theme, this overarching theme of death. But I don't see ancestors in and of themselves as being kind of the question of Samhain, being the thing in Samhain, because we also of course see Samhain associated very much with this concept of the veil between the worlds being thin. And so there is this kind of sensation, this idea that at Samhain we can pass more easily between the worlds. And of course this is like seen often as an opportunity to make contact with deceased ancestors, if that's something that you believe is possible. But I think again it comes back to this question of there's something about this time of year, maybe there's something about the waning year, the waning light, heading into the dark part of the year, that really does kind of make us turn in on ourselves and start to think about mortality, start to especially in these kind of long dark nights, and it's cold, and we do start to think about mortality, we start to think about death. And I think that that's really, in my opinion anyway, that's where this association with ancestors and so on maybe comes from. That's why that association was made with this time of year. So what has death got to do with concepts of divinity? A whole lot, in my opinion. I really think that death is really central to a huge amount of ways that we see divinity, and a huge amount of different traditions. I'm not really going to get into any other traditions other than the kind of pagan pantheist, I suppose just the sort of the general broad pagan umbrella. That's really what I'm going to be looking at. But of course the concept of death is hugely central to other religious traditions. For example, Christianity, it's such a central part of that religion. The whole idea really is of this God and of Jesus who are going to save you from a kind of ultimate death, from a death of your personality, a death of your soul, that they are going to give you this opportunity to live forever. So it is absolutely central to a lot of traditional religions. outside of this kind of pagan umbrella, this alternative spiritual umbrella. But how is it central to somebody who is, you know, maybe going down a more alternative spiritual path, and why is it central to paganism? My opinion on this is that it's to do with the centrality of mysticism and kind of mystical traditions, especially kind of Western esotericism. It really is central to the way that paganism has developed. And, you know, if you're interested in that background, Ronald Hutton, The Triumph of the Moon, is a really good historical kind of background on how Wicca and paganism developed in the, well, not just in the 20th century, but, you know, he goes right back, I think, into the 18th century, I think, to trace kind of the history of how that developed. But we really do see this kind of focus on mysticism, on spiritual experience, that I think started to be important in the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century with the rise of spiritualism, you know, talking to spirits, mediums and that kind of thing, became a really big thing kind of in the Victorian period. I think paganism really kind of evolved out of that period. It evolved out of that kind of time when focusing on the individual experience, also talking to spirits was actually really central to that as well, but focusing on mysticism, focusing on spirituality as a very individualized experience, and that was becoming a thing, and moving more away from the kind of orthodoxy of traditional religion. I think that kind of period made way for this very kind of individualized idea that we often have of spirituality and religion now, and obviously that has kind of made room for paganism to be a thing. So, you know, at the heart of it, I think we need to look at what the mystical experience is. The mystical experience is interesting in that it is relatively universal. It is a kind of a phenomenon that many different people from many different cultures experience and can kind of relate to one another about their experiences. It doesn't seem to be hugely mediated, or it can be mediated through different backgrounds, through different cultures, but the fundamentals of that experience are fairly consistent. It's just one of these kind of phenomenons that we've been able to kind of pinpoint and say, well, you know, we all seem to occasionally have this kind of experience, and what can we know about that? What can we say about it? And the word that we have tended to use is mysticism. And it's an experience that has been associated with religion, with spirituality, and so on. This is again a kind of area of study that came into prominence in the 20th century, kind of the early to mid 20th century as far as I remember. And, you know, there are some kind of fundamental elements that got pinned down around that area. If you're interested, you might want to look up a man called William James. He was kind of central to that movement of studying mysticism from a kind of scholarly perspective, and from this kind of phenomenological perspective. So there kind of evolved this idea of mysticism as being this experience, this fairly passive experience, that of kind of something that feels unknowable, that feels indescribable. At the heart of this experience is this sensation of sort of awe and wonder, but also often tempered with a slight kind of sense of fear. At the end of the day, it really just is a sensation of complete and utter overwhelm, of being totally overwhelmed by this sort of strange experience. And it also often kind of comes hand in hand with feeling as though there is some kind of knowledge being gained, some sort of truth being accessed about life, that you're kind of entering into a state of consciousness where you're able to see life as it truly is, even if that is kind of impossible to then describe or explain. It's something that can only be experienced. So the mystical experience, in those terms, it's something that has been accessed by many different people in many different ways, as I said, whether through, you know, using certain substances or just through ritual, through like various different practices, you know, across the centuries and across different traditions. But at the heart of it is this kind of sensation, as I said, of sort of a combination of awe and joy and fear, I would say. And this might be a combination that many of you will find to be familiar. I think when many of us talk about spiritual experience, sometimes this is what we mean. We mean this kind of sensation of tapping into something so much greater than us, that it is actually almost fearful in its magnitude and in just the kind of the hugeness of the experience or something. There's just something about it. There's something slightly uncanny sometimes about it too. So this is where the kind of death element starts to come into play for me, through this kind of avenue of fear and often even terror, that I feel like this experience of mysticism can start to lean into. And to describe this, a kind of another useful name to throw out there is Rudolph Otto. So he was a phenomenologist, kind of an old school phenomenologist. He's not generally kind of well respected within the religious studies circles anymore. He's understood to be too theological to be kind of used in kind of social scientific methods of studying religion. But I personally, you know, as a spiritual person, I find his ideas very interesting. And he has kind of two terms to describe the same kind of experience. He describes this religious experience as the numinous, or as mysterium tremendum. So both of these terms kind of are describing this sensation of great awe combined with sort of a kind of a sense of unease, a kind of a certain amount of fear, a certain sense of the uncanny, something that is just a little bit you know, either too close for comfort, too big for comfort, something that is so vastly mysterious and overwhelming that it actually becomes fearful. So the more that I talk about this, the more that this might start sounding to you like the way that we feel about death. And this is where I kind of start to feel like a lot of the time, the understandings that we have of divinity and what it feels like to be kind of looking into the face of God and that kind of thing, it's very, very similar to the kind of feelings that we can have when we start to think about death and to think about mortality and life and death and that strange binary, like the joy of life, but countered with the fear of death. To the point where I would even ask, under certain circumstances, is God just death? If we are looking at God as being this sort of omnipresent, omnipotent, really mysterious and kind of overwhelming force. In a lot of ways, I think God and death are very, very closely linked and absolutely go hand in hand, and can even be seen as almost the same thing under certain circumstances. But there is something kind of linked there between the sort of the fear of death and the way that we approach death and the way that we respond to this kind of sense of the mystical and contemplations of the divine and so on. And the way that I would look at it is that perhaps thinking about death, contemplating death, is an avenue maybe into a mystical experience, and it is kind of part of this really important set of kind of uncomfortable, honestly, but also very kind of awe-filled types of experiences and contemplations that I think can be really central to our spiritual experiences, our spiritual practices. So paganism really leans into this. And this is one of the things that I think many of us find attractive about paganism. It leans into the concept of death and into the kind of slight fear and awe in the face of divinity in a way that maybe we feel like other traditions kind of run away from. You know, as central as death is in Christianity, for example, there is always this sense of it being something that is being run away from. You know, Christ is crucified, he is resurrected, and then there is this kind of promise of salvation from death. That is the ultimate promise of Christianity. Whereas in paganism, you know, we see this very close link with death also, but there's no promise against it necessarily. You know, depending on what kind of branch of paganism you're interested in, you may have various different beliefs. A lot of pagans might believe in reincarnation, and you know, there is that concept of the Summerlands that I don't see coming up so much anymore, but back when I was a baby pagan, that was a big thing that, you know, Wiccans, I suppose maybe just a lot more people consider themselves eclectic Wiccans, and I don't know if the Summerlands is kind of an official part of traditional Wicca. It's not an area I know a huge amount about, but you know, there are these various different concepts of an afterlife associated with paganism, but for the most part I feel like there's a lot more of a leaning in. There's a lot more of a leaning into this sense of death as a part of life, and as something that can't necessarily be run away from. There's kind of this, you know, despite the fact that there is a lot of kind of ancestor worship and working with spirits and so on, I feel like there's less of a focus on maintaining the personality, on maintaining the self, on sort of making sure that our ego doesn't end with death. There's a lot more focus on sort of accepting and embracing the fact that we do end, and that we kind of face our demise, and a celebration of that, as the counterbalance to a life lived to its fullest. It might be a bit of a cliche, but I very definitely do actually believe that it is death that spurs us to life. It is death that really makes us do anything. I was realizing the other day, and this is something that, I have contemplated many times over the years, that, a lot of us have this kind of desire to be completely financially independent, to reach, we wish that we could reach a point where we no longer had to worry about finances, we no longer had to worry about money, that we could just win the lotto, win a huge amount of money and just never have to necessarily work for money ever again. And while there are obviously benefits to that kind of scenario, and of course it is very important for us to feel stable in life, to feel like we are not going to lose like our really fundamental needs, like food and shelter. And obviously having kind of monetary stability is really central to that. But I think the thing that we wish for, the thing that we hugely desire, is, I'm not sure that it actually would be a good thing. I'm not sure that we would actually ever really do anything with our lives to the same extent if we had a kind of unlimited amounts of money, and we never had to kind of hustle ever again, that we never had to really think about how to earn a living. I think there's probably a very perfect balance somewhere there in the middle, where we might be able to have the freedom to do the things that we actually wish we could do as a living. We might have to work jobs that we really hate, or that are really, not enjoyable for us, that are really just not feeling like what we want to spend our lives on. And of course, it would be wonderful if all of us could be able to, leave those jobs behind and do something that feels more fulfilling with our days. But the extreme of that, to the point of just not having to find any kind of employment at all, not having to do anything really to earn money ever again, in my opinion, for me anyway, I think I would find that totally paralyzing. I don't know that I would ever actually get around to doing very much if I didn't have to be aiming towards earning money, because I think it kind of focuses us towards excellence. Because even if we're trying to make money out of a passion of ours, out of something that is fulfilling to us and that is meaningful to us, something that we feel we can do that is going to kind of contribute to the world, it still requires a lot of work and a lot of trying to focus on being the best at that we possibly can be, on really kind of excelling in that field. Because, generally speaking, if we manage to excel in something, then quite probably we will be able to make some money out of it. Like, that is, it's a general principle that largely speaking kind of holds true. And without that kind of pressure of aiming to make money out of something, would we really push ourselves to excellence? I don't know that we would. There are definitely certain circumstances and certain things where we don't want to have that pressure. And I think a lot of the time spirituality, artistic creativity and things like that are things that people actively choose to not have to have that pressure, that it is something that they can do kind of in their own time, at their own pace, and enjoy more for that reason. But at the end of the day, I know, for example, if I had really committed to being a writer, for example, like a fiction writer, an author as a living, I would have spent my 20s writing. I would have written probably 10 times the amount of fiction that I've actually written in that space of time. Would I be happier? I don't know, but it certainly would have driven me to produce a huge amount more work, to be a better writer than I am now. And I'm happy with that trade-off. I'm happy that I didn't decide to go down that road, but I think that is an important point to make. And essentially, I think that the same thing is absolutely true of death. If death wasn't coming, if we knew that we were going to live forever, would we actually ever get round to doing anything? I'm not totally convinced that we would. I don't think that motivation just comes out of nowhere. I don't think that very many of us are really able to be truly self-motivated, just absolutely out of nowhere, with no sense of time pressure or anything like that. I really think that to a huge extent we would kind of fall into just a kind of humdrum life where things can just get perpetually put off, because, you know, as humans, we do take the easiest route. It is kind of how we evolved. It is kind of a central part of just being alive, is to try and make things easier for ourselves. So it would make sense that if we knew we were going to live forever, there's always more time to do something. So, you know, it is a bit of a cliche, but I think it's really true. Another part of the kind of positive aspect on death is the fact that it is death that really drives life from a really fundamental, practical, like material level, as well as on that kind of level of, like, you wouldn't live your full life if you were going to live forever. You know, on a very fundamental, actual, just material level, things have come into existence, things have evolved, you know, humans have evolved to the point that we have. Our planet looks the way it does because death exists. If death was not a thing, it's hard to imagine what kind of planet we would have if death hadn't become a part of life, of the life cycle. I don't think really... I think no matter what, some form of death is necessary for any kind of change, you know? I mean, if any kind of change occurs, then a sort of death has happened. So I feel like the way that we perceive death is just it feels very extreme, because we are very attached to our personality, we're very attached to our ego. But at the end of the day, is it really any different from just, you know, molecules attaching themselves to different molecules, breaking off, doing different things in order to kind of shape new things? And that is essentially what is happening when we die, when we are born. And that is what has, you know, made not only this earth possible, but this whole universe. And I think that's something that paganism is good at being aware of, and maybe not always fully consciously, but the fact that we do celebrate the Wheel of the Year, I think, is important. In that, I think it really reflects that respect of, you know, the life and death cycle, and the importance of decay, and so on. And this is really central, as I've said before, to the concept of the dark goddess, and just in general, I think any kind of dark gods. I really do think that maybe a better way of describing the kinds of gods, that the term dark goddess is usually used to describe. I think a better term might actually be death goddess. I think a lot of people would push back against that, because they would argue that a lot of those goddesses are not just about death, which is true. I'm just thinking about the Morrigan as the goddess that I would kind of know the most about, who would be very often subsumed under that rubric of dark goddess. You know, a lot of people would push back and say, you know, she's not a death goddess, she has a lot more going on than that, and that is true. But at the end of the day, I think the thing that draws people in to goddesses like the Morrigan, like Hecate, like Kali, I think what draws people in, what makes people feel really fascinated by them and really drawn to them, is that connection with death, is that connection to this concept of the other world. And the Morrigan is very much associated with death. She is a very kind of... I see her as a sort of guardian of different kind of worlds. She's very much a kind of a keeper of the gate of the underworld, is very much the way that I see her. She kind of comes and goes between the two worlds in Irish mythology. She's always there at scenes of battle. She's, you know, depicted as a raven, so feasting from the corpses on battlefields and so on. So she is this sort of liminal figure on the cusp between the two worlds, between the world of death and the world of life. So she is absolutely a figure of death, and she has a lot of other associations too. But that is true as well of, you know, many of those other goddesses. And, you know, there are a lot of gods as well that I would kind of consider to be part of that kind of death milieu, I suppose you could call it, in various different pantheons. And I think that is really what makes them fascinating. There is this kind of sense of I suppose, you know, Rudolph Otto's sense of the numinous, sense of the mysterium tremendum, this just a tremendous mysterious quality that is kind of overwhelming and filled with awe and that kind of slight edge of fear. And it is something that brings us to this place of contemplating not only death but the entirety of life, but the actual structure of existence. I think that's what these kind of dark gods and dark goddesses kind of make us feel. And so I see them as very, very connected to the experience of the kind of mystical experience, the experience of feeling connected to divinity. To me, the dark gods have always been that kind of key to the mystical experience, to spiritual experience, to feeling close to, I suppose, just the ultimate, close to just that feeling of connection with the entire universe, with the entirety of existence, to close to our place in this web of existence. So that to me really is what Samhain is. It's a time to pay a lot of attention to that side of our spirituality, that side of paganism, and perhaps to some of those deities. For me, the season of Samhain, it's quite a long one. It really stretches for me right the way from really kind of mid-October right into December. I don't really feel that season of Yule kicking off until, you know, quite close to the solstice, really. So the Samhain season for me is quite a long one. It really is that time of year when we're in decline, you know, that time of the year when we really do feel the lengthening nights, the shortening days. And I think it is that long for me because it is so important in my conceptualization of life and of my spiritual path. I think paying attention to that kind of the numinous, to that sense of the closeness of death is really important to my just connection to the mystical. And yeah, I think that this is why most pagans and witches and so on are really connected to Samhain, that we really feel like Samhain is our time, because Samhain is that time when we represent death, not only on our altars but in our homes. You know, we put up Halloween decorations that are full of, you know, monsters and stuff like that too. But let's face it, monsters are really about death too, aren't they? Or at least about the numinous, about the uncanny, about, you know, fear and that kind of thing. But we put up decorations of skeletons and symbols of death and so on. And so, you know, culturally, even outside of paganism, it is this time of year when that is what we focus on, when it is kind of, at least for a day, but for many pagans and witches, for kind of a whole season. This is this time to think about death in this kind of celebratory fashion. It's not in a negative way, not in a way of fear in a negative sense, almost like we use that fear to fuel the kind of positive elements of spirituality, to fuel that sense of mystery and kind of dark awe that is really so central to many of our spiritualities. I'll leave it there for now. This is definitely a topic I'll be making more videos on in the future. I have a lot of content that I want to make on the Dark Goddess. Now that I've finished my PhD on the Dark Goddess, I'll be doing my Viva next week, and I really will be wrapping up soon. And at that point, I will have just a lot more headspace to use all of that material that I worked on over those 4 years to create something that is maybe of more interest to you. And so I have ideas in mind. I'm thinking of creating an e-course in the first instance, so something a little bit like the Paving Your Own Path series, if you're familiar with that. I think something a bit like that on a kind of slightly larger scale is what I'm planning in the first instance. It'll take a long time to get there. I've got a lot of other things to get going on first, and you know, it will take time to create, but that's my plan. And all of these kind of themes are going to be things that I expand on a lot in that e-course. So yeah, keep an eye out if that's something that you're interested in. I'll mention it obviously again on the channel once that kind of comes into being. But if you have any thoughts on this, please do leave a comment down below. I always love to hear your thoughts and just see the kind of interesting dialogue that happen in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell if you haven't already, and I will see you again soon.